Great. Okay. There it is. Our recording is in progress. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar today. This one is a series that we're calling Agrivoltaics in Colorado, but we are branching out from Colorado and have some different states that are going to be sharing about their agrivoltaics legislation and programs. And then we will also zoom in a little bit and talk about local level policy here in Colorado. We recently published a land use code guidance document that I'll provide a little bit more context to at the end of the podcast webinar. So just a quick introduction. My name is Allison Jackson. I'm the Education and Policy Manager for the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center, which was founded in 2020, and that's the educational and outreach side of Jack Solar Garden. And so we provide a lot of different events, tours, presentations to community members, to youth, and also policymakers. And we have a lot of resources on our website, which we can take a look at here. So here you can see we have a lot of videos on our website, as well as a lot of written works for you. So we provide a lot of different things. We will have a feature-length film coming up soon on our website, and we will also have a 360 virtual tour of Jack Solar Garden. So those should be uploaded in the fall, and so those will be on there soon. Like I said, we have a plethora of different resources. This is examples of some of our written work. So like I said, that land use code guidance for deploying agrivoltaics in Colorado, solar design considerations for agrivoltaic compatibility. And then we have this webinar series. So this one will get uploaded later on this week. And we have a back catalog of about, I want to say 25 or 30 webinars addressing different types of topics relating to agrivoltaics. And then if you are a local person, we know that people join from all over the country, but we do have a couple upcoming local events at Jack Solar Garden or in Boulder County. So this Saturday, we have Pollinator Palooza, which is a family-friendly event surrounding insects and pollinators, and we'll have lots of fun activities and a lot of different tables where you can see what lives underneath of our solar panels at Jack Solar Garden. And then we also, like I said, we have that feature film coming out. And so we're doing a showing at the Dairy Arts Center in Boulder County and Boulder. And so that's on August 28th. And so you can find that information on our website where you can register for both these events. We'll hope to see you soon. And so a lot of what we do is outreach from Jack Solar Gardens. We do a lot of hosting different tours and events. We do a ton of field trips. These fun little ones were transplanting raspberry bushes for us, and they were finding lots of worms, which they were enjoying. And we have lots of teachers that come back year after year, so it really is a valuable resource for our educators and our youth to be able to see agrivoltaics in action. And so at the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center, we always say that seeing is believing. And when people can see those plants thriving, they can feel the difference between the sun and the shade. And they can see, cute animals taking a nap in the shade. They really see and feel those benefits that agrivoltaics has to offer. So today, we're going to talk about how we can use policy and different programs to allow for more people to experience agrivoltaics firsthand. And so why it's important, we're seeing a lot of different policy out there in the world. So Colorado has a few state level policies that incentivize agrivoltaics. We're seeing some federal funding, not enough, but some federal funding. And then also we're seeing programs proliferate across different states as well. So there's the NYSERDA one, which Kristen will talk about later on today. Okay, so the plan for today, so I'll do a very quick overview of policy across all the states, and then we'll get a more in-depth view at Oklahoma's legislation and as well as New York's program that they have going on, and then I'll dive into that local level guidance with Q&A at the end. So throughout the whole webinar, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A section, and then we will get to those at the very end of the webinar. So quick, that really high level overview. So in 2025, at least 12 different agrivoltaics bills were considered in 9 different states. And we're seeing that more states are introducing bills and trying to pass bills. And we're also seeing a good amount of bipartisan support for agrivoltaics bills. So that's important, signaling that we have consensus on dual use and agrivoltaics. So where do we have legislation already? So Colorado, as I mentioned, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nebraska, Nevada, and New Jersey all have legislation that has passed. The newest ones are in Nebraska and Nevada. Those just passed this year. Nevada allows for agrivoltaic farms to maintain their agricultural tax status. So that allows them to stay in that ag tax bracket versus moving into commercial or industrial when they add solar. And then the Nebraska one is a little tangential to agrivoltaics, but it requires the local utility to provide service to connect to farms that have solar and allows them to get paid for that extra solar that they put back onto the grid. And so this just helps agriculture become more self-sustaining and also allows for more renewable energy on farmland in Nebraska. And then there are a couple of states that don't have legislation necessarily, but have developed programs that also support agrivoltaics. And so we'll hear more about New York. And then Minnesota and Michigan, both are pollinator scorecard states where they've developed those programs for pollinator-friendly solar. And then Michigan also has a program where they allow dual use solar on preserved farmland. And so those are the programs that are there across the state. Okay, so then I'm going to hand it over now to Clay Pope. He is the Partnership and External Affairs Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Oklahoma. So he'll be talking about the Oklahoma legislation that was attempted to be passed this past year.
Well, thank you a lot, Allison. Like I said, my name's Clay Pope. I'm the Partnership and External Affairs Manager for the Nature Conservancy here in the state of Oklahoma. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy, it's one of the largest and oldest natural resource organizations in not just the United States, but across the globe. We work on natural resource concerns. A lot of people are familiar with the work that we do through our preserves and through conservation easements and work on the land. But we're also concerned with broader issues like, say, climate change. And that's kind of how we started this conversation in this space, is the issue of renewable energy, the impact that it can have as far as providing the energy we need, while also doing things to make sure it's done in a way that's cleaner, that we try to reduce the impact on the climate, and helps us get a little bit further down the road as it comes to addressing climate change. If you're familiar with Oklahoma, the majority of our energy comes from renewable sources in the state of Oklahoma right now, primarily wind, but we're seeing expansion of solar as well. And with that has come some concerns about the impact that solar can have on local areas. And I know from a Nature Conservancy standpoint, when we deal with these issues, a lot of times we talk about our 3 C's, which is climate, conservation, and community. And when you start to think about the community aspect of that, and you think about the culture that comes along with that, a lot of times we miss the fact that farming and ranching is a culture that's distinct to a lot of our areas. And we need to understand that when you lose that farm ground, what that can mean. I know from background in earlier work that I've done with other organizations, heard a lot of people with the Conservation Reserve Program, with CRP. One of the big concerns is great program, especially when you're dealing with issues like soil erosion and wildlife habitat. But when you take that land out of production, that can have an impact. All of a sudden, you've got those acres that aren't producing a crop. The local grain elevator is impacted, the local machine dealers. You start to see some spin-off effects throughout the economy. A lot of those same questions have been raised when it comes to the development of solar energy in the state of Oklahoma. That land is a lot of times taken out of production, and there's fear that could have a cascading effect across the economy as well. And you lose some opportunities as far as continuing that agriculture production into the future. So in looking at that, one of the things that we wanted to do was to see if there was a way that we could split the difference a little bit between the two issues of energy production and agriculture, which led us to the issue of agrivoltaics. And really, when you're talking about the legislation that we did in the state of Oklahoma, we actually worked with the legislature, with the chairman of our utilities committee in the House, the vice chairman of our agriculture committee in the Senate, to come up with a bill, House Bill 2157, that really just established a task force to look at the issue of agrivoltaics in Oklahoma. Because when you think about this idea of blending agriculture with solar, agriculture is not a one size fits all. You've got different realities in different places. And when you look at a state like Oklahoma, really the low hanging fruit is going to be in grazing. There are opportunities for doing some things as far as some crop production underneath solar panels. But when you think about the main agriculture production in Oklahoma, small grains, cotton, the size of equipment, the type of operations you're looking at, that really does that really isn't a good fit. But running cattle or running sheep or running other livestock around these panels, that is something that I think there would be a lot of interest, and that was what we kind of wanted to start looking at, is how this could all fit together. Now, I mentioned cattle. I'll get back to that in a little bit, but clearly that's the low-hanging fruit in the state of Oklahoma. But there's questions on that. There's also questions on, what are the costs to developers? Are there incentives that we could provide? Are there issues that we need to look at from a research standpoint? And so we came together with this idea of forming this task force to sit down and look at the overall issue of agrivoltaics. The bill didn't pass. We got it all the way through the House and the Senate. It actually got to conference committee. There was a little bit of difference between the House and the Senate version, and it's sitting there. The legislature runs on a 2-year cycle. It didn't make it all the way through the issue this year, but next year it is going to be something that it is alive for consideration. And I think that's important, because if you followed any of the news in Oklahoma on energy policy, toward the end of our legislative session, we run every year from the 1st of February to the last Friday in May. There was a lot of talk about trying to do some things on setbacks on wind and solar, and it finally broke down into just a big fight between the House and Senate leadership. And toward the end of the session, the pro tem of the Senate said, "We're done. We're not going to do anything." In fact, there were bills that actually just set up a simple permitting process on solar and solar batteries that really there wasn't a lot of controversy on, that didn't even have conferees named on them in the Senate, because it was just there couldn't come to an agreement on one way or another as to what they wanted to do. We were actually fortunate that we were able to get conferees put in on both the House and the Senate side, and we're able to file a committee report that allows this legislation to stay alive for the next year. Now, I'm counting that as a victory, even though we didn't get to the governor's office. But even more important, the idea of a task force, like I said, is just to kind of look at the issue. And to a certain extent, the bill did its job. Just having the bill out there has really helped kick off the conversation in Oklahoma on the issue of agrivoltaics. We actually are in conversations right now with folks about establishing at least one demonstration farm in the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma State University, our land grant school, they've got a lot of history in working with landowners and informing them on their rights and issues that they need to look about when it comes to energy. If you think back on oil and gas, one of the things that they've traditionally done in the state of Oklahoma is through extension service, provided information to landowners, whether you're a surface owner, a mineral owner, or both, things that you need to look at when you're negotiating deals on how oil, especially in oil and gas, where pads are put on your place, how the roads are constructed, the zones that you're going to lease to for oil and gas production, things that you have to consider when you're talking about pipeline easements. They've worked on these issues going all the way back to the late 1940s. They've also done some of this in the area of solar, or in wind, excuse me. But now with the growth of the solar industry, there's a lot of this is actually the issue of agrivoltaics is something that they're looking at putting together some fact sheets and doing some educational tools on, to let landowners know what their options are when they're talking to a landman, when they're negotiating those leases, to see if there's not a way that they can incorporate some of these concepts into those leases that they have for their land. And now beyond that, like I said, the demonstration farms, we've had some interest from our state conservation agency about doing some research on this proof of concept, to also look at issues surrounding things like soil health, water quality, when you start to think about runoff, wildlife habitat, different mixes of grasses that you would have. Oklahoma State, again, I mentioned the situation with the extension and outreach. They're also looking at issues as far as grazing, looking at some of the things as far as rates of gain. Are there things as far as heat stress that these solar panels can help can help deal with? Are there challenges? Looking at different designs. These are things that actually all sprung out of that discussion that we had on that bill, even though it didn't make it to the governor's desk. And on top of that, we're actually having an interim study in our state Senate that we're going to be part of the first week of September, bringing this issue up again, bringing folks to come in and testify before our Senate Agriculture Committee and keep this discussion going on agrivoltaics. So we feel like we've been able to get the ball rolling. We've got some things going. And one of the big things I really want to talk about is the fact that we are focusing on cattle. That is one of the big things that we're really looking at in Oklahoma. Obviously, we're not shutting the door on any options. But like I said, when you talk about a state like Oklahoma, grazing livestock really is the low-hanging fruit. That's the place we can focus on. And when you think about even crop production in Oklahoma, a lot of our wheat ground in the state's what's called dual-purpose wheat. It's winter wheat that's planted, it's grazed in the wintertime, cattle are pulled off, they cut the wheat's then cut for grain, and then you repeat the process. Most wheat farmers in this state are set up to run cattle. A lot of them have their own cow-calf herd. We've got the water, we've got the fences, we've got the know-how. If we can find a way to incorporate that in conjunction with the development of the solar industry in the state, I think that's got a lot of benefits, and it helps meet people where they are. This issue of concern about the impact that it can have on the local agriculture economy. This helps address some of that. As an ag producer myself, and as a guy who raises dual-purpose wheat and raises cattle, I don't know a lot about sheep. I really don't. No, I've been playing around a little bit with goats, but everybody talks about grazing hair sheep, and that is an option. Like I said, we're not wanting to close the door on. But if you can come to me and say, hey, you're already running cattle, this is something you might be interested in, that's an easy way to start that conversation. And I think a way to, again, to really plug into where the agriculture economy is, where the rural community is, and help us have that discussion, not just on how we can protect that agriculture culture, that community that we want to continue on into the future, but also help us overcome some of the automatic opposition that some people have to the development of renewables. This idea that it's either or agriculture or renewable energy, that's just not true. There is a happy medium. We can thread the needle, and that's really what we want to work on and hope to continue with the discussion here in the state of Oklahoma. Again, our bill didn't make it all the way through, but again, I feel like it really got the discussion started. It's began its job, and we'll move on with the journey from there. And hopefully in the future we'll see some additional activity that can help encourage agrivoltaics and can help educate landowners and folks at the local area as to what they can and can't do on their land.
Fantastic. Can you just give us a little more context? Like, what is the general sentiment about solar in Oklahoma? How are communities and landowners feeling about that?
It's really interesting if you look at it. To a certain extent, the state's divided in two. In western Oklahoma, which is more your traditional agricultural land, ironically, there's probably a little bit less opposition to the idea of renewable energy development. That's actually where most of the wind power is in the state right now, and there's a little bit of history understanding that again, these things are not mutually exclusive. Eastern Oklahoma, there's been some concerns there, but even there. There's actually a poll done that showed from 2 to 1. People in the state of Oklahoma support renewable energy. They support all sources of energy. They want to see an all of the above strategy. And when you think about a state like Oklahoma, if you can have wind and solar, like I said, the majority of our electricity is already provided by wind power right now. And solar is starting to catch, especially with the development of data centers, with what we're seeing as far as additional pulls on our grid, that demand for energy is just going to continue to grow. Now, we're also an oil and gas state, and there's a lot of interest in natural gas. But when you stop and think about it, you're looking at a 3 to 5 year delay on getting the gas turbines, and then probably another 3 years to get your plant in place. Whereas you can have a solar field up in about 18 to 24 months. And when you do the math on it, over time, once you get the initial build out on solar panels, it's cheaper than natural gas. And everybody will tell you that works in the industry. Wind is by far the cheapest. Right now, natural gas is a little bit cheaper, and solar's coming in third. But you get that build out, there's not the additional continuing reoccurring costs that you see with natural gas. But you definitely could see wind and solar providing the majority of your power, with that natural gas providing that base load, having that backup when it is nighttime. And you do have, and even though Oklahoma, we like to talk about how, our state song talks about the wind coming sweeping down the plains. We're used to a lot of wind in the state of Oklahoma, but there are times when it blows more than others. So having that base load with natural gas, again, wind and solar providing the rest of the power, it's a natural fit for this state. And I think most Oklahomans see that. Now, that's not to say there's not localized concerns and there is localized opposition. And there's the reasons for that are myriad, and I could go into it, and I don't want to try to read somebody's mind as to what is or isn't the tripping their trigger to be opposed to something. But I think if we can show people that you can split the difference between some of these concerns, that again, it's not an either or situation. I mentioned, one of the things that at the Nature Conservancy, we're also concerned about wildlife habitat. And we have a tool called Site Renewables Right that we actually developed back in the day when wind power first came into Oklahoma to try to avoid critical habitat. We're working with developers to use that tool, and we've actually added a layer that looks at prime farm ground to try to, again, inform some of these discussions on how siting is done. So I think it's something that we can overcome. But again, if you look statewide, the majority of people do support the development of all energy sources. But I would be lying to saying if there weren't localized folks that have a lot of concerns when they first hear about these projects.
Mhm. And then we're seeing a little bit of this in Colorado and some other states. Are you seeing any tension between local governments and state governments in Oklahoma?
It's kind of it Oklahoma, we really the most of your decisions are going to made at the state level. There can be some decisions made at the local level. There was a large data center that was going in northeast Oklahoma. The county commissioners did deny them a permit. It's actually being tried in court and we'll see what the courts say. But bottom line is that most of the authority rests with the state. It's mainly centralized in Oklahoma. It's kind of interesting. You have that in northeast Oklahoma. There was actually a group of county commissioners that opposed not a solar but a wind development in northwest Oklahoma. But the whole reason that they opposed it because it was going on school land, and they said if this is going to be developed, we want to see it developed on private land so that the landowners themselves can take the economic advantage of the development of the renewable energy system. So they weren't against renewable energy; they just wanted to make sure it was done so that private landowners made the money instead of the state of Oklahoma on school land. So again, you kind of see that shift in different parts of the state. But no, I mean there is, and a lot of that again, when you have some localized opposition, there is local governments responsive to what they're hearing from folks, and a lot of times they're the folks that are most loud that are talking the loudest. So that's a natural response that you would see. But again, most of that rests at the state level, and then and again, you look statewide, that the majority of people do support the development of all sources of energy, if you can believe the polling.
Great. Thank you so much for that update. So now we will move on to New York State. So we have Kristen France, who is a project manager with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And so they're leading a research and demonstration project portfolio. And so I'll let her share her slides.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? And is my slide up? It looks like it is.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with and really learn from you all today. I'm looking forward to it was really interesting to hear Clay's talk, and I'm interested to hear from Allison, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with the Q&A. I'm going to give you some brief context about NYSERDA, what my team does, and the context for solar renewables development in New York, particularly solar, and its intersections with New York agriculture, and kind of how New York is approaching those intersections to kind of set the context for the agrivoltaics research and demonstration portfolio that I lead, that's really just developing now. And I look forward to your questions at the end. So first and foremost, maybe let me start with what is NYSERDA? So NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and it's a public benefit corporation made up of energy experts and really primarily focused on, paving the way for New York's clean energy transition. So we're a state entity, public benefit corporation. We're a little bit different, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. Again, here's our mission, vision, and promise. The thing I want to emphasize here is that, really, the NYSERDA serves as a resource for energy information, policies, and programs. And we do a lot of analysis and planning. We foster innovations and try to figure out how to get them to market. And we do that through a lot of strategic partnership, including a lot of public-private partnerships. And that's the sort of the approach we're using with the agrivoltaics demonstration portfolio. The group that I sit within, the environmental research group, we Our purpose is to really provide sound scientific research to inform decision-making relative to energy-related environmental policies and goals. So these are our focus areas, and sort of my focus areas within the renewable energy space, as well as sort of policy accountability, looking at the effects on communities and ecosystems, so communities, people, agricultural communities, of the way that we're, shaping the clean energy transition. In terms of, let me set the stage for, in terms of, the renewable energy development with New York. New York has passed ambitious climate legislation in 2019, and it set many, many goals, but including a 70% renewable energy by 2030 goal, which is pretty ambitious. I should know the percentage that we were at the time it passed, but it was a lot lower than 70%. We have a lot of hydropower and we have a little bit of wind, but it's nothing like what what Clay was talking about in terms of the majority already being supported by renewables. And in terms of a scoping plan was developed to implement the legislation. It's at this timetable on the right for solar. And so you can see it's a pretty steep increase that's needed between 2020 and 2050 in terms of how much solar deployment would be needed to meet the goals. There's also, right now the state is NYSERDA is in the process working with others on a draft New York State energy plan to another look, given the current context, about how we're going to meet the goals. And I wanted to know, in terms of the solar goals, there was an interim goal, and that goal of 6 gigawatts by 2025 has been met. There's a 10 gigawatts by 2030 goal. And these graphs just show, the bottom graph shows sort of the yearly capacity that's been added, and the top is the cumulative for distributed solar. So you can see just sort of the pace of acceleration from 2000 to 2024. And I will say that most of the solar that has gone in to date is distributed solar, community solar. NYSERDA's New York Sun program supports this. So there's more than 800 sort of community solar projects. And I want to say that the siting for this, in contrast to a lot of Western states, the siting for this is largely very local. New York's a home rule state with land use decisions made at the sort of municipal level for towns, villages, and cities. In terms of the current queue, though, there's also large scale. It's shifting more to large scale renewables greater than or equal to 25 megawatts. And that power is sort of purchased by NYSERDA. And there is legislation that was passed a number of years ago to create a sort of streamlined permitting process that is at the state level. So for those large scale projects, there is a process at the state level. Just for contrast to other states, just so you have that kind of in the back of your mind. So in terms of how solar intersects with agriculture in New York, development and improvement of agricultural lands is encoded within the New York State Constitution. New York really is a fairly strong agriculture state. You can see there just where our national rankings are in terms of what the leading products are, and dairy products, and really also the forage and silage to support the dairy industry is big in New York, and that's sort of where a lot of the sort of pressing concerns are about solar. Because, in terms of, depending on what you know about New York's geography, New York's prime agricultural districts and much of its prime soils, as well as its flatlands, which are only about 20% of the state. So it's within the many of them are within short distances to transmission lines. So the combination of short distance to transmission and on flat lands and limited availability of flat lands means that this is, solar is being sited on agricultural land, and communities, have a range of perspectives and concerns about it, really quite similar to the kinds of concerns that Clay just highlighted for Oklahoma in terms of impacts on the economy, and especially in some counties and in some agricultural regions, there's more pressure than others. And so there's concern about sort of what are the impacts if enough is taken out of production, for local agronomies. So given this, the state has recognized this, and NYSERDA has helped establish and facilitates an agricultural technical working group with several representatives from each of these stakeholder groups, and they're supported by technical and facilitation contractors, and I work a lot with this group. And the mission of this agricultural technical working group, or ATWIG, which I will probably say, is to provide advice and guidance to assist the state and other stakeholders in really kind of understanding and managing the potential interactions between renewable energy development and agricultural lands, and develop collaborative processes to kind of identify and address stakeholder-driven priority issues related to the, trying to accelerate renewable energy development while also protecting the state's agricultural economy and communities. Um, the ATWIG has really prioritized agrivoltaics as one of their focus areas, and they have an agrivoltaic specialist committee. And they've been doing the work to kind of identify what are the knowledge gaps to better understand the viability of agrivoltaics across a range of industries and sites in New York, and provide guidance on how policies and programs could be shaped or changed to advance agrivoltaics. They produced a report in 2023 that identified a lot of important actions and research questions, and that's really driving a lot of the work that I'm doing. That the research portfolio that I'm leading is focused on. The ATWIG also has really been involved in advising and helping NYSERDA to do a number of things. Just for a little bit more context, so some of the things that NYSERDA has been doing that intersect with agriculture and agrivoltaics, both the large-scale renewables and the New York Sun programs, which is sort of large-scale and distributed solar, they have a requirement for solar projects to adopt New York's Ag and Markets Department's solar construction guidelines. So that's an attempt to kind of do the construction in ways that protect the soils and enable it. There's also an agricultural mitigation payment is required for any projects that affect more than 30 acres of prime agricultural soils. And in the recent years, they've been developed if the developers, develop a really meaningful agricultural co-utilization plan, including agrivoltaics, or they're really working with the farmer to keep some or all of the land in production. Then the costs that go into developing and designing and building to accommodate that co-use can be used to reduce the agricultural mitigation payment. And the mitigation payments go to ag and markets for the protection of farmland. The other thing is there's a smart solar siting scorecard that's been developed. And so this is part of the bids that come into NYSERDA when NYSERDA issues a solicitation to procure the large scale renewables. And the solar siting scorecard is a way to incentivize and steer and try to avoid prime agricultural lands and active agriculture, as well as forests, and then where it can't be avoided, then to really kind of minimize through strategies. And the 2025 version of the scorecard has a real emphasis on trying to award even more meaningful points for agrivoltaics that are really trying a lot of that are trying to really do co-utilization on the same land. There's also the Clean Siting team has developed a guidebook for communities and model local laws to try to accommodate dual use in agrivoltaics. And this has been particularly important. This sort of, because of that local land use, really there's kind of a wide mosaic of some communities have completely forbidden solar development on agricultural lands. Some are really encouraging it. So the pattern of local laws is kind of wide ranging. So that's something else that NYSERDA has worked on. And then there's the work that my group is doing, and we've been developing a research and demonstration projects portfolio, which I'll talk about. My group had kind of reviewed market research and done interviews across the country to kind of understand the state of agrivoltaics. And, I'm sure you guys are aware, most operating agrivoltaic projects, and this is definitely changing, but the majority probably still, other than sheep grazing, are, they're publicly supported research plots. Jack's Solar Garden is amazing, sort of, and it's really distinctive example of one of the few. And so recognizing that we're still kind of in fairly early phase research about how to do this, sort of at scale, and understanding the agronomics and the market costs. We realized that we needed and wanted to implement, and fund and support R&D projects that can help investigate and illustrate agronomic viability. We also really heard from the ATWIG and other stakeholders the importance of really having agrivoltaic research sites or demonstration sites in New York that farmers can visit and learn from, being able to see and touch, as you were saying earlier at the start, Alice, and the importance of really being able to see it, investigate it, be able to talk with other farmers about it. So to do that, we have issued a request for proposals, really trying to catalyze public-private partnerships whereby NYSERDA funds the incremental solar and agricultural costs. It was a 5 million competitive solicitation with up to 750,000 available per project, with up to 500,000 for those incremental costs. So like the extra money, the extra labor it takes to both design and build to accommodate agrivoltaics, fund that portion of the project, and then up to 250,000 for sort of the agricultural and research and outreach costs. Um, Projects were eligible if they integrated solar and farm operations. Basically, the only exclusions were sheep and biofuels, and sheep not because it's not legitimate, but it's happening a fair bit within New York, and so the need for sort of the sense was that the need for demonstration was less. And the other key thing was that the projects needed to agree to participate in research, sharing data, and they needed to, be willing to host tours and demonstration, and help really kind of share the lessons that they're learning and do outreach. We are still working to get the contingently awarded projects under contract, so stay tuned for press announcements and more information once that happens. But I can share that we're really hoping to have kind of a good mix, a diverse portfolio among the projects that we're working to get under contract in response to this request for proposals. We hoping to have cattle grazing, including pasture-raised dairy, which, as I talked about earlier, is really important for New York. In contrast to kind of to what Clay was saying in terms of, I think within New York, farmers do not feel like cattle are going to be an easy lift. And not that it's easy, Clay wasn't saying it's easy, but I think there's a fair number of concerns about sort of the expense of needing to raise a panel. So I think really wanting to get on the ground data about how much is this going to cost? What's like the minimum design specifications that'll make this work? Also pigs and poultry, harvesting hay and other row crops within kind of an array of a range of array spacings and heights, and also some vegetable and specialty crops. We're hoping the current mix has both projects that are happening, under and between standardly built arrays that already exist, as well as projects that are being built and almost built right now to accommodate agrivoltaics, as well as some projects that are, that have not yet started construction. And the project teams really include a range of important partnerships. They're really we are pleased and we're trying to have them be really deeply collaborative with the farmers, and includes a couple of projects where the farmers are really in the lead on the contract. And then the last thing I'll say, we're engaging a research contractor to support all of the projects. We wanted to make sure that the ability to do research wasn't a barrier to projects, so we wanted to provide good research support across projects. And we submitted a request for qualifications for that, and are currently developing a scope of work with a really strong interdisciplinary research team that includes agronomists and also sociologists who are already deeply engaged with farmers and agricultural communities in New York. So we're excited about this. We want to be able to determine the impacts of solar array modifications on energy yield and performance. We want the impacts of construction and operation on the environmental site conditions and the farmer's experience. Identify differences between agrivoltaic production and more traditional production, and also understand the social and economic impacts of the agrivoltaic projects and the perceptions and experiences and the learnings of the people engaged. And we want to try to be able to set up a sort of context and framework for how what we observe in these projects, which is going to be a small portfolio to start with, might apply or be modified in other contexts if they were replicated or scaled. We're going to try to really regularly and frequently communicate lessons learned from these projects. We don't want to wait until the end. The projects are going to be operational for 5 years after construction, so it's long. We're hoping to get a lot of data, but we want to be sharing lessons learned and stories early and throughout. And we're hoping to generate a body of evidence, and including peer-reviewed materials that can help sort of inform policy and management and support them. And I think these are just some resources that are all linked within that hyperlink at the bottom. And with that, I just thank you, and we can take any questions from Allison or move on to Allison herself.
Great. Do you have any idea when those grant announcements will get out there in the world?
I am really crossing my fingers. We are hoping to do a press release for several of them in September, so stay tuned. And I'm hoping that the remainder will, once we have to wait until the contracts are fully executed, and I'm hoping the remainder will be done by fall. The part of they're complicated projects, and the current climate and changes and the economic calculus it has made finalizing some of these challenging.
For sure. Well, and I just want to say I love the inclusion of tours and outreach as well as the research. We would love for there to be, you know, Jack Solar Gardens or Agrivoltaic Learning Centers all over the country so that everybody can experience agrivoltaics. Thank you for that. Okay, I guess I will switch back over to my slides. Okay. Why aren't you in full screen? Okay, I guess that is full screen. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in a little bit on local level policy. So similar to New York State, Colorado is a home rule state. And so the county level government is typically the permitting authority here in Colorado. And so we started in 2024 looking at all of the county level solar regulations across Colorado. So we looked at all 64 counties. And so why we decided to do the guidance was based on first this report, right? So we saw that there was a need for some guidance for these counties because when we assessed it, only 60% of the counties had any solar regulations at all. And there were some that, maybe had a definition and nothing else. And so there was really a hole that we thought we could fill with this guidance. We saw that the regulations varied really widely among those counties. Some were very comprehensive, others were not very comprehensive. And that there were 19 counties that had no land use code specific to ground mounted solar at all. So they might have had rooftop, but they had nothing about ground mounted solar. And we were also seeing that there was concern from local communities at the same time. We saw that there was a bunch of moratoria that went in place around the western slope of Colorado where communities were concerned about losing farmland. They were concerned that the power wasn't going to benefit those local communities. And so we saw that several counties, 5 different counties were having moratoria that weren't allowing new solar projects to move forward. And we saw that counties that had really comprehensive codes were overperforming where the solar was going. So when they had those comprehensive codes, that's where 75% of the projects were located, and 89% of the solar capacity was also located in those counties where they had those clear and comprehensive solar regulations. And then finally, we had some information from state agencies where they're working on a solar siting report, and they're also creating a repository of codes. And so there's also interest from the state to have more guidance for these counties. And so why do these regulations matter? Like we said, definitions are super important, especially if there are going to be incentives included. So there's a lot of discussion about does agrivoltaics include pollinator habitat? Does it include things like ecosystem services? And so if you're going to have incentives, you want to be clear about what is included inside that definition and what would fall outside of that definition. And we see that counties and communities are much more supportive if you do have these dual uses, and they're seeing that there's more local community benefits then there tends to be less community pushback for these projects as well. And so we based our land use code guidance on what we call our 3 principles of agrivoltaics. And we think that these are relatively small changes that can allow for a much greater usefulness of the land under the solar panels. So what are those 3 changes? So the first one is going to be about increasing accessibility and reducing the barriers for agriculture. And so you're going to either do that by elevating the panels, or if you so choose, you'll reduce your amount of solar per acre, but you can space out those solar panels as well to allow for that agriculture. So low panels just tend to limit the usefulness of the land underneath. It's hard for people to work under that land. It's hard for crops will start to grow over the top of it, and then you're going to lose out on your solar. So just providing more space for animal and people and crops to grow allows for the land to be used much more integrated with the solar power. And so here you can see, so at Jack Solar Garden, we have not spaced out the panels any further, but we've raised them higher off the ground. And at the section with the cows, those are beef cattle, and those are under 8-foot tall panels. And so we saw that they came out in September. They just love to eat the nice lush forage and then take a nap in the shade. So having those panels higher is really important to allow for those larger animals. Next principle is what we call wire management. So here's some examples of wire management at non-agrivoltaic sites. You can see that there are some loops that go down lower, and then there's these bundles of wires that make it a little bit harder for animals and people to work in that space. And so at our farm, we prioritize that wire management. We wanted everything to be as neat, high, and tight as possible, and make sure you bundle those wires or put them inside of conduit or as flush as possible with other solar infrastructure. And so here you can see at Jack Solar Garden what we've done. So we have this wire mesh that covers all of those loose wires underneath of there. And so that just protects anybody from a hand or a horn or a tool accidentally pulling out a wire and causing a bad interaction. So like I said, we just try to keep everything as high and tight and neat, and that allows for animals to move through there, for people to work in that space better. And then the last principle, so it's generally just preventing soil degradation and protecting that soil health long term. And so avoiding grading as much as possible. So this, especially in the West where we don't get a lot of precipitation, if you grade the soil, you're going to set that soil back hundreds of years with, you're going to kill off all of that soil microbiome, all of that structure to the soil is gone. And so it's really important to avoid grading as much as possible. Why do they do grading? They do it so they can facilitate installation a little bit faster, and they have a consistent kind of tilt of the panels. But we are finding that there are more and more tracking systems and racking systems that it can accommodate those changes in elevation, and that grading is becoming less prominent, which is great. And so other things you want to think about is just reducing soil compaction from your construction traffic. So limiting how many passes across the land, especially the places that you're going to use for agriculture. You're going to limit how many times that big equipment can walk through there, or even just personal vehicles. So having a specific place for parking that is not where you're going to have agriculture in the future is super important to maintain that soil health over time. So that will help support your plants afterwards. That will help with infiltration and increase carbon sequestration as well. So this is the construction at Jack Solar Garden. They actually use the pile driver and install both sides of the posts at one time. So they were able to have the passes that pile driver had to do across our farm. And so then, yeah, we did some ripping and tilling after the fact, but we did it very mindfully and tried to limit how much the tractor was moving across that land to prevent that soil compaction. Okay, so more into the detail of the guidance that we put out there. So there's really 3 main sections to it. So definitions, we talked a little bit about why those are so important, but especially if you have those incentives, you want to make sure that it's clear what is in there and what is not, and also provide definitions for all sorts of things. So land use code in general has a very large section full of different definitions. And so that was included as part of this as well to be consistent with other land use code. The next section was about potential incentives. So things where you could reduce the setbacks if you did include agrivoltaics, or change the permitting structure to allow for agrivoltaics to be built more quickly. So those are incentives that could be used at the local land use code. And then finally, this was the meat of the project, was our agrivoltaic design standards for farmland preservation. And so a lot of this was focused on pre-planning aspects of the project, which really allow that integration of agriculture with solar. And so the most important section is what we call the agrivoltaic development plan. And so this addresses a lot of those principles that we just talked about. So I'll go through those quickly. So panel heights, it talks about vehicular obstructions and electrical system design. as well as that grading, vegetation preservation, and minimizing site disturbances. So those are all part of that, what we call the agrivoltaic development plan. And it also includes a couple other plans. One was just an agriculture like implementation plan. So just gives the county an idea of what your plan is for how you're going to do the agriculture. And then we also included a stewardship report. So this is like an after the fact every 5 years, just to give the county some idea of how the project is going and if their regulations need to change, right? If you're saying, you know, this made it really hard for us to do this project, maybe they would eventually take that land use code and update it based on information from those stewardship reports. And then there's one more section of design standards that are pretty common to land use codes for any type of project, but really for solar as well. So things like setbacks, visual impacts, decommissioning, and stormwater management. So that goes through really all of the different sections of it and just providing some language for counties to think about when they're thinking about how to integrate these agrivoltaics. Like communities say you want agrivoltaics, and a lot of times county land use planners don't know how that translates into code language. And so we just wanted to provide an example of that for them to get a chance to look at and adapt and use as they see fit. And then there's two more sections that I'll briefly address, which is going to be our supplemental codes. And so these are additional code sections that we wanted to see that counties across Colorado aren't all the same. They have different priorities, and they set those out in what we call master plans or comprehensive plans. And so we did an analysis of the different county master plans across Colorado, and we found that preservation of farmland and conservation of natural resources and wildlife are the most popular, and that we also had some counties that wanted to protect rural character and scenic quality and then encourage renewable energy. So those are all the things that we saw across there. So we developed two additional supplemental codes to demonstrate that one size doesn't fit all for all of the counties across Colorado. There are different priorities. So two supplemental codes, which are going to be conservation solar. So this is how you can integrate either land conservation or biodiversity goals into a solar project. And so a lot of the same principles apply with not degrading the soil, but there are additional things like thinking about fencing, thinking about mitigating habitat disturbance and things like that that are included in that section. And then Colorado is a very beautiful state, and we know that different areas have a very high regard for their view sheds. And so there's another short section about mitigation for really distinct and beautiful view sheds as well. And so that is basically all of the information about our land use code guidance for deploying agrivoltaics in Colorado. So we're hoping to we have some questions in here, but if you have any other questions, please drop them in there so we can answer them for you. I did have one question for everybody, which was, how do you feel personally about, the possibility of any new agrivoltaics legislation, or do we need more agrivoltaics legislation in some of these states? And so I will open it up to our panelists here.
Well, I guess I can go ahead and take a stab at it first. I think at some point, I think we could see some additional legislation. I think right now, just getting people familiar with the concept. To be honest with you, when we turned this study bill through the Capitol, the biggest thing was just telling legislators what agrivoltaics really was. I mean, it was a concept they hadn't heard before, and kind of visiting with them about what it really could mean. I also think having an understanding of how it can fit into Oklahoma. I know Kristen said that there was worries about cattle and heights, and Allison, you and I were talking about this before the call came on. I'm going to be straight with you. I have been around cattle since I was old enough to know anything, and I have never seen a cow climb up on something like a solar panel. Now, they're going to rub on the side. They might lick on the wires. That's an issue of conduits and wire harnesses and things like that. I think there's a little bit of, and I'm not saying, as soon as I say that, then I have a proof concept they'll tear all the damn solar panels out. But at the end of the day, I honestly think, and we'll find out, that's why we're trying to do some demos, that there are ways we can do this that fits into that fits into the realities on the land. And I think then from there, we can start to build out as to what we need to do as far as incentivizing things. I think the first step right now is getting people familiar with the concept, showing them what the options are. I'm really excited about the possibility of partnering with Oklahoma State University Extension on some of the fact sheets and outreach and education to producers to get them to understand, get the ag organizations to understand what we're talking about. Electric co-ops are actually who we're visiting with on the demo farms. I think there's a lot of interest in that because they're interested. They're not in the renewable energy business. They're in the cheap electricity business. And as I said, whenever wind and solar, over time are your cheapest sources, they want to make sure that there's broad-based acceptance on the project. Well, from their owners because they're owned by those they serve. So is there that I think there's some things there. And once we get people comfortable with that, we have the conversation going, then I think we can start looking at seeing what kind of good fits there are in Oklahoma as far as additional policies to try to incentivize agrivoltaic statewide.
Yeah, the education has to come first before the policy, right? A lot of times people are like, what are you saying? What is what something? Yeah. So yeah, that's the first important step. Kristen, so you have a program in New York State, but not necessarily any legislation. You think that they will pass anything?
Yeah, so I think just sort of seconding what Clay says, I think part of where I think NYSERDA is coming from is that there's a need for this evidence base in order to then be able to inform what kind of incentives and policies should take place. That said, there have been a couple this past legislative session. There were a couple of bills that were in committees. Neither of them made it to the floor in either house, but one of them that we think is potentially likely to get picked up next legislative session. It has a sister bill, there's sister bills in both houses. And so there's definitely interest, I think. But I think even so, I think much of what's been proposed is along the lines of sort of, let's do some demonstration programs and build the evidence base. I think the questions in New York are around, around the incremental costs and how much is it going to cost and what the disease and electricity affordability, is really front and center, sort of within New York. And so I think it's trying to figure out sort of how can it pencil out long term, and are the benefits in terms of community acceptance plus the sort of the economy-wide benefits of keeping agriculture viable. So I think we're very much in terms of like trying to get that agronomic, the sort of the economics of the cases, as well as sort of the logistics and the confidence, and can this be done?
One question was, so can you speak on how useful it was to look at what other state policies are out there in order to inform what you were doing?
I can start and just take it briefly. Super useful, and I'll just name it. I've only been doing this work for a little less than a year now, and so I'm still feel like there's a lot I want to learn from what other states are doing, but it's been hugely helpful. And so opportunities like this to connect as well. I'm keenly interested in sort of continuing to be aware of what other states are doing in terms of research, what they're learning, and also what's going on in the policy context, including sort of how I think New York may contemplate what are different approaches to citing that it could be done, and how different states, like Clay, you were mentioning in terms of, the Nature Conservancy's efforts that they did early on with wind and how that's still being useful now. I think there's a lot to learn from, even though the sort of land use decision making is really different across states. I think there's still a lot to learn sort of from how those kind of dialogues got facilitated and what was helpful.
Well, I just kind of echo that. I mean, you don't want to reinvent the wheel if there is looking for
Yeah.
those other options to see what works and what hasn't worked in other places is extremely helpful.
Yeah.
I think from our approach, we're not to the incentive, we're not looking to incentivize things yet. It's more at the educational standpoint. And I'll be honest with you, we kind of took the same approach with carbon sequestration back in the early 2000s. We actually came in with a study to set up a carbon program and kind of looked at what other states had done through that, and then set up a program that was very successful. One time we had over 70,000 acres under contract in Oklahoma for carbon sequestration. So I mean, we're trying to do the best of both worlds. Take the information that other folks have done, take their experience, and then, as Kristen kind of alluded to, turning around and making it fit the reality on the ground in the state where we're at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, states have taken different approaches, tax incentives or the feed-in tariff, like in Massachusetts. And so, yeah, it's really nice to see the different policy implementations that states have approached it with. And then there's another question. So someone asked, are dual use and agrivoltaics synonymous, or does dual use encompass more than agrivoltaics? So dual use would be more broad than agrivoltaics, and dual use would include things like brownfield. So that would be redevelopment on, industrial sites that have contamination. So you can compare solar with that. And so dual use is more of a broad topic, whereas agrivoltaics is where you are doing agriculture production in the same space, coupled in the same space as the solar power. Is that how you're seeing it as well in your states? Is it different? Are people using different terms in different ways?
I think that's similar, and I'm glad for the question because I'm always kind of curious how other people are using the terms, especially being kind of newish to the space. But my similar sense in terms of dual use being like a broader term and agrivoltaics sort of it being narrower. And I'm curious that, I've also potentially heard like sometimes dual use is like ecosystem services and pollinators, which has like agricultural benefit, but also agricultural benefits to other things in ag, is that in or out within definitions of agrivoltaics? I think that's an active point of conversation amongst people that I talk with.
Yeah, and I think that there is a designation between dual use or ecovoltaics and agrivoltaics, and I mean, but at the end of the day, I think it's all again about trying to find that and to get the most benefit out of the development the best you can for both the environment and for the economy. And I think I think those can all be rolled into it, and then you just got to try to split those hairs as best you can when you talking about incentives and things along those lines.
Next one. So has anybody compiled a list of best practices for construction that would help us to implement in compiling requirements for EPCs in an RFP? I think that some of the land use code guidance could also be used, thinking about preventing that soil compaction, some of those sections about maintaining vegetation and also reducing grading as much as possible. I think that would be a good place to start. We don't have a full best management practices for construction, but that's also a great idea, something that we could think about developing in the long term. Kristen, you had something to add?
Yeah, I can add. I was trying to see if I could quickly look up the hyperlink. So it mentioned New York State Ag and Markets has solar construction guidelines, and I think it's a version from 2019 that I'm certainly willing to share. I think some other states may have it too. I don't know if Massachusetts does, but I'm certainly open to sharing this. And the other thing I'll say is I think one of the things that I've heard that is a challenge is also it's helping EPCs develop the skills and abilities to actually implement the guidelines. So it's having the guidelines, but then having an environmental monitor on site or someone who, especially in terms of like with dealing with the topsoil, it's like how can developing and building the skills sort of among EPCs to be able to then implement guidelines for that kind of soil protective work.
Mm-hmm. And I meant to say this earlier, but a lot of those resources from NYSERDA are great. That smart solar siting and the solar construction guidelines, those definitely were very helpful in developing our land use code guidance. So I would definitely recommend that people check those out.
I'll put a hyperlink to what I think is the current one in the chat.
Sounds great. And then, so please address how USDA changing USDA policies and increasing tariffs are impacting the reality of agrivoltaics for small producers.
I mean, I
Everyone
think
jump on that?
I think from my perspective, I mean, obviously the position taken by USDA and some of the changes in the incentives that we saw in the reconciliation bill are going to have an impact and it's going to slow some things down. Flip side of that is, like I said, the demand for energy production is not going to slow down. You know, unless we're just going to surrender to China and say we're not going to get in the AI game anymore. You guys take it, and we'll just allow ourselves to fade off into the past and no longer be a major player in the world's economy or the world's politics. That's not going to happen. You're going to continue to see the need and take data centers out of it, just the growth that we're seeing on the need for additional electricity. We have to have the power from somewhere. And when you just do the math, like I said, wind and solar is cheapest. I mean, I'd say that natural gas is cheaper until you get the build out done. But bottom line is they need to be in the mix and we need to have those sources. People talk about things like nuclear energy. You know, we're 20, 30 years before we're really going to see, in my opinion, from what I've read, that we're going to start seeing some of that. I think as long as you don't strangle the industry in the crib, it's going to continue to grow. Now, the flip side of that is that, you know, there are things that slow that down. But I mean, I'll be honest with you, as a producer, as a landowner in Oklahoma right now, wheat price of wheat in Oklahoma right now, you can get about $4.50 a bushel. Break even's around $6 a bushel. I can get 1,000, you know, right now the lease rates are going around $800 to $1,000 an acre every year for 30 years. Now I ain't real smart, but I can count. And you just do the numbers on something like that, and it shows that from a producer standpoint, there's a lot of incentives to try to look at these things, and with the need for energy on top of it. And then if you can run cattle in as well, say if you've got a kid that wants to come back to the farm or you want to stay active in the operation, now all of a sudden you can run those cattle out there. And conversely, we've got the lowest calf crop right now, or projected to, since 1941. 500-pound calves are bringing over $2,000 a head, which is just insane which is great as a cattle producer. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But at the end of the day, it is, you know, the numbers are there that it's going to continue to grow. So that's the thing that I see, is that then if it is, then how do we do it right? How do we make sure that we're citing these things right? How can we give those options to the landowners, split the difference and move forward? Because I think unless you're just going to flat out ban it, it's not going to stop.
Great. Yeah, it was disappointing to hear about them no longer reimbursing for solar, just because that allows farmers to be more self-sufficient and be more energy independent. And so that is disappointing. But yes, I think that the industry will continue. It will have to, you know, evolve over time and make changes. But I think that it will still continue to be a viable option in the long term. Okay, our next question. So we have a question from a utility scale PV designer or solar PV designer currently working on a project in Texas that would like to graze sheep. Do other states have similar design guides, or is Colorado unique? And then other states, so I'll answer this one. So we just put this out in July this year. So it's very, very new. So this is our first opportunity to really share about this land use code guidance. I think that a lot of this stuff is applicable to most of the Western states, especially when a lot of it has to do with that soil compaction is much more of a concern in these drier, hotter areas of the country. And so it should definitely be applicable to a lot of Texas. And so, yeah, we would appreciate your help in getting this out into city governments and county governments, and having them take a look at it to see if any of this is valuable to them. And then they said there are a company is also working on a project called Garnet Mesa, which is on the western slope of Colorado, and that includes sheep grazing. Yes. So yeah, I think we have sent that guidance around to all the counties in Colorado, and we're hoping to see some counties start to think about these things in the long term. But yeah, I think Texas, it would also be valuable for that as well. Next one. Someone has heard concerns in Southwest Colorado about the ag status being abused by solar companies. So they will graze sheep for only 2 to 4 weeks out of the year, and then they're still able to claim that ag status. Are there guidelines for what can actually be considered, quote, agrivoltaics. Is there a good definition that you guys are working with in New York State?
So the Agricultural Technical Working Group has a definition, which I can maybe read off, but it doesn't, it wouldn't address the frequency thing. I'm trying to see if I can, yeah, the current definition that the Agricultural Technical Working Group has adopted, which I'll say they're also evaluating whether or not they should update their definition, is, a simultaneous use of land for solar generation and agricultural production of crops, livestock, and livestock products, as that phrase is defined by New York's agricultural and markets law. And so then there's a long list of that. And so, but that, I think it actually needs to be like an agricultural production. And so within New York, there's some debate if the sheep are not being used as as a product, if it's husbandry and they're grazing, but they're not, but a product isn't. That's sort of an active debate within the community in New York. And I will say, sort of a definition for agrivoltaics and what should count, what isn't. It's definitely active topics of conversation within the Agricultural Technical Working Group. I know the American Farmland Trust has recently put out a policy paper on that and proposed a definition. Certainly, the proposed bills within New York are proposing definitions that have some overlap with. So, and each grant program, like, may define in terms of what the point of sort of the grant program is. I think sometimes there's yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Which I realize I'm sorry, an ambivalent answer, but.
And we're not to the point where we would have that, but that is as you start moving, if you do try to incentivize the activity, if you have a different land treatment when it comes to ad valorem taxes, or if there's some other kind of incentive, whether it be through permitting or taxes or whatever it might be, it's got to be clear that it's an agricultural operation. Then we're just going to have to sit down and negotiate that out. And we've done that in other things. I mean, Oklahoma, you don't think about, we've got a big timber industry in Oklahoma, and it's treated different than the rest of agriculture. Equine, you're trying to split that difference between actual what you'd consider to be agriculture and those folks that are, that aren't using horses for what we would consider to be an agriculture purpose. So I mean, there's just those are just the kind of hairs you've got to split when you make the sausage that is legislation.
Yeah, I was going to say definitions are tricky, right? You want to be inclusive, but not exclusive of things that you would like to incentivize. There are, in other countries, there are a lot more robust definitions and legislation, but they're also finding that those can have negative consequences as well. So when they say you're only agrivoltaics if you maintain 75% of the crop yield, and so that can take people that are doing their best to do agrivoltaics and not allow them to be considered agrivoltaics. So it's like you don't want it to be abused by being too loose, but then when you set all of these really stringent and prescriptive measures, it also can have a negative consequence as well. And so, no definitions that I know of have really specific frequency type of language in it, but more so that, you have to produce some sort of product at the end of that, whether it be livestock, fiber, food, something like that. And then, so somebody is trying to plan one for Herfano County, Colorado. You might want to go and look at that first report that I talked about that we did in conjunction with the National Renewable Energy Lab. There should be information about Herfano County specifically. So that would give you some information about the land use code and the permitting structure that would be required. You also would need to talk to your utility in that area if you plan to sell back to the electrical co-op or whoever it is down there. So you need to talk to them. If you wanted to do behind the meter, then you would just need to start thinking about how you would finance that. And so if we go, one of my slides earlier in here was about how to get started with solar power. And that would be a really good resource for somebody just starting to figure out how to start their project in a specific county. And we have one for Clay. So it says, could you talk more about the carbon sequestration legislation you mentioned in Oklahoma, specifically around the financial case, whether that penciled well, and now it was estimated beforehand? I'm not sure the second part of it. But you want to talk a little bit more about that carbon sequestration
Yeah.
program?
The carbon sequestration program, it's still on the books in Oklahoma right now. It's a little bit dormant with some of the changes that we've seen on policy nationwide. It actually was created back in the days when there were discussions around Waxman-Markey and the initial approach to cap and trade. Basically, what we did was we have an independent state conservation agency. It's not tied to our Department of Agriculture or Department of Environmental Quality. It's a standalone agency that interacts with the conservation districts throughout the state, works primarily with NRCS on the federal level, but it's also the lead agency on non-point source pollution in the state of Oklahoma. So EPA, especially Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, come to our Conservation Commission. What we did, though, was give them the authority to verify carbon credits on behalf of the state of Oklahoma, basically to serve as the umpire. And what we did was, at that time, working with NRCS, they actually worked with our Conservation District employees to get a lot of them trained to do visual verification on different practices. Now, if you remember back at that time, the Chicago Climate Exchange was running, and they basically had their numbers were a 10,000 foot head cut, obviously, but it was the best you had to work with. It was based on geographic location, on what you'd see as far as the amount of sequestration that would be recognized from a practice. So, say if you took 160 acres of wheat ground in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma, converted from conventional till to no-till, they had tables that said you on average will sequester X. Now, if I'm in Woodward County, I do the same thing. You'll sequester Y. And so, then the trick was we had our district employees that could go out and verify, make sure that producer had made those conversions on practices, primarily conversion to no-till, also grass plantings. A lot of it, I mentioned the 319 program, a lot of it was tied in with the work that was done to address non-point source pollution. The State Conservation Agency in Oklahoma, the Conservation Commission, basically takes those dollars, turns it into another cost share program targeted in those priority watersheds, and then does those land use practices that are designed to control erosion and with it runoff into water bodies in the state. Actually, I had a lot of success on them. Brag on Oklahoma. We actually taken more streams off the EPA impaired list than any other state in the union. You can check me on that too. That's a true story. But what we were able to do was to go out and when those landowners converted to those practices, then based upon the value of those credits and who wanted to buy them, then they could sell those credits. You could find an aggregator. Our state association of conservation districts actually acted as an aggregator at one time to bundle those carbon credits together and then to sell them. Now, these were not done on the CCX. These were direct sales. They were not traded on the open market. A lot of them were bought by electric co-ops in the state of Oklahoma, to be honest with you. And you talk about the financials on it. You weren't getting rich selling carbon credits. I mean, really, you were looking at probably about, $150, $200 for 160 acres converting to no-till in most of Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like doing a hunting lease. It's like the first time we did a hunting lease, well, my brother said, well, that's kind of crazy. The deer are out there no matter what. It's like a guy driving in the front yard, throwing out $100 bill and driving away. And it's like, well, yeah, if these guys are going to convert to no-till or or take highly erodible land out of crop production and put it back to grass, doing pasture management, they're doing it for other reasons. This is just an additional payment that they get on top of that. And so it was a way to try to, again, to get additional benefits for those good conservation practices that has multiple benefits. Now, since then, that's evolved a little bit. The CCX went away. One of the things that they did do was Oklahoma State came in behind and actually did some testing, some soil tests to verify how those numbers matched up to those tables that the CCX had. They weren't off that much, quite frankly. They were pretty close. But also things like avoided emissions, because I mentioned carbon sequestration. You take land out of crop production, you're also burning less fuel. So there's also avoided emissions that go along with that need to be calculated. And so that's some things that are there. Like I said, with the pressure off of not as much consideration being given to cap and trade and not the desire to get ahead of that and not the desire on the part of EPA to try to play around with some of these concepts, that program's kind of gone into mothballs. But like I said, for several years though, it worked fairly well. And there was a lot of interest in carbon credits. Like I said, we had over 70,000 acres at one time under contract. There were people buying carbon credits, not just electric co-ops. There were a handful of folks that were buying them themselves, but there was definitely a lot of interest and a lot of synergy there. And I think someday that may come up again, but we're not there right now.
Great. Thank you for that. It looks like we just have one question about, not really a question, but legislation is the only way to get the land stewardship we all deserve. Utility scale developers are really only concerned with one thing, which is profit. How does that play out in your state? Do you think this legislation will push people to consider more about the land stewardship aspects and the agricultural values of the land?
Well, I think from an Oklahoma perspective, again, that I think that there are times that you need to have regulations and to take action, and definitely when those times are necessary, I'm supportive of that action. I will say this, that I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm also involved in my family's farming and ranching operation. My father always used to say, as a farmer, you can lead me anywhere, I'll be damned, but I'll be damned if I'll be pushed. You put in there, I'm going to do the bare minimum, and that's all I'm going to do, and I'm going to be upset about it. Sometimes you got to do that. Now, but the flip side of that is, if you can incentivize it, if you can do things, and going back again to what I said about Oklahoma State and knowledge that the landowner has when they're negotiating some of these leases, that's a lot of that's a powerful tool in the hand of an agriculture producer if they want to see this kind of activity on their land. And having those options, having that information there when they are negotiating those leases, I'm hopeful we're going to see a lot with that. Now, beyond that, I think you also get into issues on local politics. What is the incorporation of agrivoltaic practices something that takes a little steam out of the boiler, so to speak, of the people who are opposing what you're trying to do with your operation? Maybe is that really something that they are concerned about, how the loss of agriculture activity is going to impact, the businesses and the infrastructure in the community that builds around, say wheat production, taking it out of crop production, the elevators, the chemical dealers, the implement dealers. Is that something they're truly concerned about? If so, is this a way that you can minimize that a little bit and actually help with the acceptance of a project, and maybe avoid some of the local concerns that you've seen there? Now that's I don't know, and that's a good question, and I think we'll find out more as we move forward with this discussion in Oklahoma. And it may be that's something we'll just see how it evolves as we go along with time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, there is reticence from some utility scale developers to do agrivoltaics because they're worried about economics and the costs of all that, and so it isn't irrational for them to think that it will cost maybe a little bit more or just require more planning and more time and effort thinking these things through. And so we just tried to make it as streamlined as possible. Obviously, we need a rollout of renewable energy across the country, but thinking about how that land can be utilized in the long term and not losing all of that agricultural valuable land. Kristen, did you have anything on that front as well?
I think you guys have said it well, and I think I'll just repeat. I think part of the companies do, need to weigh costs into consideration, and so I think that's part of why we're really trying to sort of develop the evidence base in terms of like, what are the costs, how can you streamline them, and then what are the subsidiary benefits, what are sort of the broader economic benefits to the community, so that we can sort of provide that context to evaluate for policy, but also to not just to inform policy, but to inform communities and developers and farmers. So because of all the stakeholders, have different purposes and concerns, but they all have sort of potentially like a need to be able to see it in action and to be able to kind of understand how it's playing out in terms of the economic impacts, as well as sort of, their time, other resources that can translate to money, but also, but also other benefits.
Great. We answered all of our questions. So thank you to our panelists for coming today. It was really interesting to hear about how different states are tackling this agrivoltaics legislation and programs. And I thank you to all of our attendees today. Like I said, if you know of any colleagues that would enjoy this, we will take the recording and have it up on our website probably by the beginning of next week. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you at our next webinar in a couple months. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.